buckaroos and buckarooettes. Time for another exciting installment of the clarinetist vocabulary. I'm sure you guys have been waiting on pins and needles for the next installment, so let's get started right now. You remember last time we talked about the very nature of musical sound, and we divided it into two essential aspects: the interior aspect, or the qualitative aspect, of pitch, color, and shape, and then the extrinsic aspect of what we would call dynamics, or playing loud and soft. Well, in this video, we're going to be talking about exactly what happens when you bring to bear those variables of loud and soft on the intrinsic aspects of pitch, color, and shape. And this brings us to a phenomenon that we have to deal with as clarinet players called stability. And we're going to talk about that right off. When we say stability, what exactly are we referring to? Well, whenever you change dynamics, play louder or softer, make a crescendo or a decrescendo, the pitch, color, and shape don't remain exactly the same. There are always changes in pitch, color, and shape. The clarinetist's duty is sort of to minimize those things unless he or she is varying them for specific artistic reasons. So the big labor on clarinet is to try to get as much stability in pitch, color, and shape as you can in the dynamic changes. But before we talk about exactly how that's done and what to look for in equipment to find equipment that will facilitate your efforts, let's talk about the effects themselves. For instance, when you play louder, what happens to pitch, color, and shape on the clarinet? Well, the first thing that happens is that the pitch tends to sag. That's one of the first things that we notice. The louder you play, the lower the pitch gets, which is the very opposite of what strings and, say, brass do when they play louder. They actually get flatter, or they actually get sharper, rather. Well, and when you play soft, what happens to the pitch? The pitch on the clarinet tends to rise, especially if you're playing incorrectly. All right, and it's just the opposite, of course, with strings and brass. As they play softer, they get lower and lower in pitch. Isn't that a delight in ensemble playing? Well, what about the color? Well, generally speaking, when clarinet players play louder and louder, the color of the sound gets brighter and brighter, so you have more and more highs in the sound. The clarinetist, of course, labors, and he labors a whole lot in certain areas to try to reduce those effects as much as possible, because most classical clarinet players are not real hot on being told that their sound is bright or edgy. Maybe that's a compliment to novices or non-clarinet players, but it's certainly not a compliment to a professional classical clarinet player. And then there's the issue of shape. Now, shape, when it's good, it's very well defined. But as you play louder on the clarinet, what happens to the shape is it tends to spread. What we say spread, it gets very amorphous, and it begins to rupture if you play too loudly. And if there's too much instability in that area of the clarinet you're playing, the shape will rupture and shatter all over the place, and it'll just be a big mess. Big pitch, color, and shape just into an amorphous, horrific audio mess. And you don't want that. So, and what happens then when you play softer? I have no idea. When you play softer on the clarinet, you're going to find the pitch rises. And especially if you're playing incorrectly. The more incorrectly you play, the more inefficient your equipment is, the sharper that sound's going to be. And you'll have to do that in order to control it. Now, if you're playing correctly and everything's efficient, then you can minimize that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But anyway, the general tendency to a greater or lesser degree is for the pitch to rise. Well, now what happens to the color, so to speak? Well, the color will tend to get kind of white and kind of pale. Let's say that the mezzo forte or the forte sound is a nice rich color. Well, when you play softer and softer, most people, especially if they play incorrectly, most people will begin to change the color of that sound, so it would be like taking, say, a nice rich brown and then beginning to throw in lots of white and yellow or whitish yellow into it, so that finally the brown turns out to be a very kind of tan color. And what happens to the shape? Well, the shape often gets very dispersed. Sometimes it gets very choked down, very flat, sort of two-dimensional. Instead of having that nice round three-dimensional shape and everything, it really gets pinched down so that it's almost two-dimensional. So especially if you play incorrectly, the more incorrectly you play, or the more inefficient the equipment is, the more these tendencies will be present in the sound. Okay, so those are the effects of dynamic changes, generally speaking, on the pitch, color, and shape, those intrinsic elements. And when we're referring to that particular phenomenon, we are talking about stability. Stability refers to the relationship of the effects of dynamics to pitch, color, and shape. Besides the issue of stability in pitch, color, and shape in dynamic changes, there's also a very, very important phenomenon that we need to consider, and we're going to be discussing it next. And that issue is the issue of response and resistance, and their effects not only on individual tones and how those might change in pitch, color, and shape and otherwise, but their effects on your ability to connect those tones into a convincing, elegant, coherent, beautiful musical phrase. Okay? So we'll be talking about that next time, and until then, hope you guys stay warm and hope the weather gets better in your neck of the woods, just as I hope it gets better here. See you next time.